The chandeliers above cast a golden light over the ballroom, bouncing off the polished marble floors and glittering wine glasses. I stood just inside the doorway, the heavy fabric of my trench coat settling around my boots as I scanned the crowd. Laughter and polite applause filled the air, but my eyes landed on Robert, my father-in-law, lounging in his chair like he owned the place. He spotted me and smirked, leaning toward the man next to him. "Just an office clerk in uniform," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. The words slid across the room and hit me with the dull thud of something I'd heard 100 times before, but tonight they felt different, like the prelude to something only I knew was coming. The MC's voice rang out over the speakers, smooth and formal, thanking the guests for their service and attendance. I took a step forward, the sound of my boots against the marble cutting through the polite hum of conversation. My heart was steady, almost calm, because I had rehearsed this moment in my mind so many times. "Brigadier General Jessica Morgan, please come forward," the MC announced. The words seemed to hang in the air for a beat, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. I saw a champagne flute slip from someone's fingers, shattering on the floor in a spray of bubbles and glass. Heads turned in unison toward me. Mark's eyes widened, his mouth parting as if to speak, but finding no words. Robert's smirk vanished, replaced by a blank stare that seemed to strip him of every ounce of his usual swagger. Helen, my mother-in-law, reached for his arm as if to steady herself, her eyes flicking from me to the MC in disbelief. The murmurs began, small ripples at first, then growing into a soft tide of questions and whispers. I walked forward, the trench coat swaying with each step, my gaze fixed on the podium. Every face I passed carried a different mix of curiosity, confusion, and recognition. The years of quiet service, of being dismissed and overlooked, pressed against my ribs like a weight I had learned to carry without complaint. Pride rose in my chest, warm and steady, but threaded through it was an ache for the years I had lost to their narrow vision of what mattered. Tonight was not about proving them wrong. It was about finally standing where I had always belonged, in plain view, with nothing left to hide. When I reached the front, the MC smiled as though he had been waiting for this reveal all night. The applause started hesitantly, then grew as more people began to understand what they were seeing. I let the moment stretch, meeting Robert's gaze from across the room. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. I lifted my chin and took my place on the stage, the question hanging unspoken between us all. How did we get here? And I knew the answer was a story worth telling. I first met Mark at Fort Benning on a blistering summer afternoon. He was a newly minted lieutenant, still learning how to stand without looking like he was posing for a recruiting poster. I outranked him by a notch, which he found both amusing and slightly intimidating. We hit it off quickly, mostly because he was charming in that effortless way, and I was willing to let him have the spotlight. Back then, I thought letting someone else shine was just being gracious. I didn't realize how quickly it could become a habit. Meeting his parents came a few months later during a long weekend in Georgia. Robert greeted me with a firm handshake and a once-over that felt more like an inspection. He was a retired Marine, 3 tours in Vietnam, a chest full of ribbons, and a firm belief that the only real soldiers were the ones who kicked down doors. Helen stood beside him with a warm smile, but Robert's was the kind of presence that filled the room. After the introductions, he poured himself a bourbon, settled into his recliner, and asked if I enjoyed organizing coffee machines for the Army. I smiled because I thought he was joking. I told him I managed millions of dollars in military assets, coordinated movements across multiple time zones, and kept entire units operational without firing a single shot. He took a sip, nodded once, and said, "So, spreadsheets." Then he turned back to the television. Helen tried to change the subject, but the damage was already done. It was the first time I felt the sting of being reduced to a punchline in my own story. That night, as Mark drove me back to base, I laughed it off. I told him it didn't bother me, but the truth was it did. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Robert dismissed my entire career in less than a minute, as if the work I did didn't count because it didn't come with a rifle in my hands. It was the start of a pattern I would see again and again, where my role was invisible unless it could be summed up in combat terms. At the time, I told myself it was just one bad first impression. I didn't yet know it was the opening chapter of years spent in the shadows. Most of my career lived in rooms without windows and hallways without plaques. I wasn't the one you saw in photos shaking hands on a tarmac. I was the one on a secure line at 3 in the morning, rerouting a convoy of emergency medical supplies to a Puerto Rican hospital before a hurricane made landfall. I convinced air traffic control to clear an unplanned military flight when every commercial route was locked down. We made it in time, and hundreds of patients lived because we did. There was no headline, no family phone call, just a closed report filed in a secure database. Then there was the cyber breach that almost collapsed the Eastern Seaboard's banking network. It started as a small, suspicious data packet buried in a vendor's invoice. I caught it because I'd spent years staring at movement logs and could feel when something was out of place. Within days, I had 6 agencies in coordination, servers running hot, and a small war being fought through code. We stopped the attack before the markets even knew they were under threat. The financial collapse that could have followed would have made national news for years, but the story was over before it began. Back home, none of this mattered. At Sunday dinners, Robert talked about Mark's latest training exercise as if he had single-handedly defended the country. Helen asked if I was enjoying my desk job. I learned to smile and say it was going fine. The truth was, I had led more operations than they could imagine, some of them more dangerous in their quiet way than any firefight. But to them, danger didn't count unless it involved boots in the dirt and a rifle in hand. It's a strange feeling to be both indispensable and invisible. The work I did saved lives, protected the economy, and kept our allies safe, but it existed in a world my family didn't want to look at. I carried that silence for years, telling myself I didn't need their recognition. Still, there were nights when I sat alone in my apartment after a mission, staring at the wall and wondering what it would be like if just once they looked at me the way they looked at Mark. Not as the background, not as a supporting role, but as the person who held the whole thing together. It started slowly, the way hairline cracks appear in a wall long before it collapses. Mark stayed later at work, came home distracted, and left his phone face down on the table. At first, I told myself it was just the stress of his assignments, but the signs kept stacking up in neat, undeniable rows. A hotel charge that didn't match his travel orders. A civilian contractor's name appearing in his email threads more often than mission updates. The faint scent of perfume that wasn't mine. I didn't ask him about it. I didn't slam doors or demand answers. Instead, I did what I'd been trained to do in every high-stakes operation. I observed. I logged dates, times, and details in a small leather-bound notebook, the kind I used for classified briefings. Every entry was crisp and clean, stripped of emotion, just like an intelligence report. There was a strange comfort in controlling the record, in making sure the facts were captured, even if I never used them. At night, I would lie in bed next to him, his breathing steady and untroubled, and mentally review the file I was building. It wasn't revenge I was planning, it was preparation. In my line of work, you never acted without knowing the full scope of the situation. This was no different. I was gathering intel on the quiet battlefield my marriage had become. And deep down, I knew I was getting ready for a mission he wouldn't see coming. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a logistics report. The voice on the other end used my full title, Colonel Jessica Morgan, and told me the Department of the Army had approved my promotion to Brigadier General. I had not applied for it. Someone high enough had read the right files and decided it was time. They offered to hold the ceremony at the Pentagon, quiet and contained, the way it usually went for intelligence officers. I thought of Mark's upcoming award banquet, the stage already set for his moment, and I felt the shape of an idea forming. I asked if the announcement could be made there. in front of the people who had spent years overlooking me. There was a pause before General Parker spoke again. I could hear the smile in his voice when he said, "Let them underestimate you." I replied, "Always." It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about taking ownership of the story. This time they would see me on my own terms, and there would be no mistaking who I was. The ballroom at the Willard Hotel glittered under crystal chandeliers, each drop catching the warm light like frozen sparks. A brass band played a medley of patriotic tunes, the notes bouncing off marble floors and gold-trimmed walls. Officers in dress blues and crisp service uniforms filled the rows, medals gleaming on their chests. Mark stood at the center of it all, polished shoes and a smile that looked rehearsed but charming enough to pass. The MC read his citation, dressing up routine logistics work in the language of battlefield heroics. Robert sat in the front row, chest puffed, hands folded in satisfaction, as if the whole event were proof of his own legacy. When Mark took the podium, his voice was steady, carrying just enough humility to sound genuine. "I want to thank the men who wore this uniform before me," he said, glancing toward his father. Then he looked in my direction and added, "And to my wife, Jessica, for keeping the trains running." Laughter rippled through the room, the kind that fills space but leaves a sting. I kept my expression still, as if the comment had slid right past me. Inside, I noted the moment and tucked it away like an entry in a classified file. The applause swelled again, the brass band picked up, and I could feel the anticipation gathering in my chest like pressure before a storm. Robert leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the scene, while Helen beamed and smoothed the hem of her skirt. Mark stepped down from the stage, medals shining under the lights, shaking hands with a trail of officers. I stayed seated, coat still buttoned, waiting for my cue. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the certainty that the program was almost over. That was the beauty of it. They thought the climax had already come and gone. They thought the rest was coffee, finger food, and polite small talk. I sat there, knowing they were seconds away from realizing the real headline of the night had nothing to do with Mark. The MC stepped back to the microphone, his voice warm but carrying a note of formality. "Before we close, we have one final unscheduled announcement," he said, letting the pause hang in the air. A few people shifted in their seats, expecting a housekeeping note or a minor recognition. "This award is for an individual whose leadership and strategic command recently prevented a large-scale cyber attack on the Eastern Seaboard banking system," he continued. "The Department of the Army has authorized a field promotion to Brigadier General." I rose from my chair, unfastened my trench coat, and let it slide from my shoulders. The white service jacket caught the light, 2 silver stars gleaming at my collar. For a heartbeat, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air vents. Robert's eyes widened as if he had misread the scene entirely. Helen's hand flew to her mouth, and Mark froze mid-blink, lips parting without sound. I walked toward the stage, each step steady, each click of my heel a reminder that I belonged here. General Parker met me at the podium, shook my hand, and pinned the medal with a grip that felt like acknowledgement. The applause began polite, then grew louder as rows of officers stood, one after another, until most of the room was on its feet. When I spoke, my voice carried without strain. "I won't go into my career," I said, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "Much of it is classified, but I will say this support is not less. Strategy is not soft. Logistics is not background." And I let the silence settle before continuing. "Behind every medal pinned on a chest, there are names you'll never know, people who built the bridge in the dark so others could cross into the light." My gaze brushed over Robert, Helen, and finally Mark before returning to the crowd. "You don't need a rifle to serve. Sometimes all you need is a spine of steel and a chair no one thought mattered." The applause roared, breaking whatever spell had held the room still. I stepped back from the microphone, not needing to say more. The moment was mine, and it had taken years to arrive. The moment the ceremony ended, a small line began to form in front of me. Officers I barely knew shook my hand and offered firm congratulations. A few of them mentioned missions they'd read about in briefings, but had never connected to a name. The applause had faded, but the energy in the room still hummed. Near the middle of the line, a young cadet stepped forward. She looked barely 20, her cap slightly askew as if she had rushed over. She leaned in just enough to whisper, "I didn't know we could be that." Her voice carried a mix of awe and hope that caught me off guard. I smiled and told her, "You can." It wasn't a speech, but it was the truth. When the line thinned, I saw them. Robert, Helen, and Mark stood together near the corner of the room, half in shadow, watching me. Robert's posture had softened, no longer braced in that unshakable Marine stance. Helen's eyes were damp, and Mark kept shifting his weight as if unsure whether to step forward. I didn't move toward them. Not yet. The space between us felt like part of the change that had just begun. 6 months later, I pulled into Robert and Helen's driveway on a quiet Saturday afternoon. The house looked the same from the outside, but when I stepped into the living room, something was different. Against the far wall stood a new glass display cabinet. Inside, framed in soft light, was my Brigadier General medal and a photograph from the night of the ceremony. Robert came in from the kitchen, drying his hands on a towel. He glanced at the cabinet, then at me. "Took me too long to see what I was looking at," he said. His voice carried no sarcasm, just a weight that felt like acknowledgement. I nodded, not needing more. Sometimes words only dilute the moment. That evening over dinner, the conversation was lighter than I expected. Toward the end, Mark set down his fork and met my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, "for making you the background in our life." I let the silence stretch before answering. "No one gets to decide your value but you." He nodded, and for the first time in years, I believed we might both understand what that meant. If you've ever been underestimated, you know the sting of someone looking straight at you and still not seeing you. You know what it's like to have your work, your effort, and even your identity reduced to a footnote. For years, I told myself that silence was the price of keeping the peace. I believed that if I worked hard enough, the results would speak for themselves. But the truth is, sometimes the world needs you to speak. Sometimes the silence you carry is not weakness at all. It's strength, waiting for the right moment. I'm not telling you to fight every battle or correct every insult. That will drain you faster than any hard day's work. What I am saying is this: never mistake being overlooked for being irrelevant. The two are not the same. Your value does not vanish just because someone else fails to recognize it. That value belongs to you, and no one can take it unless you hand it over. I spent years in the background, moving pieces no one noticed, making calls no one knew about, and solving problems before they ever became public. It was invisible work, and for a long time, I let that invisibility convince me that I didn't deserve to be seen. What I learned is that you can hold your ground quietly until the moment comes to step forward. And when it does, you walk into the light without flinching. If you're listening to this and thinking about all the times you bit your tongue, all the times you smiled through someone's dismissive comment, know this: you are not alone. There are people everywhere who have been told they are less than they are. Some of them are sitting next to you right now. Some of them are listening with you. And some of them are waiting for a story like yours to show them they can do it too. I want to hear your stories. I want to hear about the moments you stood your ground, or the moments you're still waiting to take your stand. Put them in the comments. Share them because someone else might read your words and find the courage they've been looking for. That's how change spreads. One story at a time, one voice at a time. So the next time someone looks at you and decides you don't belong, remember that they're looking at a chapter, not the whole book. You know the work you've done. You know the roads you've walked. And when the moment comes for you to claim your space, I hope you do it with the kind of quiet certainty that makes the whole room turn to see who you've been all along.